I am going to invite Matt Schaefer to now tell us about Sempervirens and tell us more about your cause, the Redwoods, and the dangers of climate change.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. It's great to get to connect with folks who are committed to protecting the environment around the state. Redwoods are iconic in the state of California, as I'm sure you know, and so it's a privilege to speak on their behalf and tell you a little bit about what's going on with coast redwoods in California. I'm going to share my screen in a moment with a presentation. I'm going to start off in a little bit talking about Sempervirens Fund, and then I'm going to switch to a very short 30-second video. And then I'll come back and go through a presentation and talk about redwood trees, the range of the coast redwoods, some of the threats, and what we're doing about it. If you have questions along the way, please, feel free to let me know if you need something clarified or repeated. You can also use the chat to ask questions, and I might answer them along the way, but I know we'll leave a little time at the end for conversation. So thank you so much for having me here. You should see in a moment my screen. And let me introduce you to Sempervirens Fund. We are California's first land trust. We work to protect and permanently preserve redwood forests, wildlife habitat, watersheds, and other important natural and scenic features of California's Santa Cruz Mountains, and encourage the public appreciation and enjoyment of the environment. That's our mission statement. We helped establish Big Basin Redwood State Park in 1903, and ever since then, we've been helping establish, add to, expand public parks and private conservation lands for almost 125 years. This is the Coast Redwood Range. It goes from southern Oregon to Big Sur in California. That's the contemporary range. You can see here also where it was, many, many years ago. It was a much bigger swath of the coast of the United States. Only 5% of the oldest trees remain. We'll talk a little bit more about old growth redwoods specifically later on. Logging, especially in the late 1800s and early 1900s, essentially robbed the coast redwood species of hundreds and thousands of years of established forests and important characteristics that support the forests themselves, wildlife, plants, waterways, and people. Just to give you a much deeper sense of the redwood species, it's a very ancient species. If you go back to just after Pangea started to break up and the continental drift began to happen and our current formation of geography exists, you can see that the redwood species over time, there are many, many different versions of redwoods that have existed over hundreds of millions of years. Fossils have been found all of these places around the world. So that they are the coast redwood, the species we're focusing on today, is isolated to the coast of largely California. It's pretty amazing. The current remaining species include the coast redwoods, the giant sequoia, and dawn redwoods. And the Santa Cruz Mountains coast redwoods, or Sequoia sempervirens, from where our organization gets its name, are the dominant tree species. Why the Northern California coast? The northern coast of California offers ideal habitat for redwoods to thrive, especially because of year-round fog and precipitation, cool temperatures, and abundant groundwater resources. Despite extensive clear-cutting, second-generation forests or newer forests have thrived for much of the last century, but they are under threat. Impacts on precipitation and fog, plus drought and rising temperatures, are stressing redwoods. And as you might be able to tell here, their morphology, how they grow, is smaller and more slender and less complex the further south you go. And that underscores the stress that they're under. Talk a little bit about redwoods as a marvelous and amazing species. In my 4 years here at Sempervirens Fund, I would say hardly a week goes by that I don't learn something new about redwoods. Here, I will showcase two facts that I thought were particularly relevant to our discussion today. Redwoods, like most trees, of course, pull in carbon. But there's no tree on Earth that pulls in and stores as much carbon as redwoods. Research says that up to they store as much as 2.5 times as much as any other tree species. But as those redwoods are stressed, that storage itself is even being taxed. Redwoods have really cool leaves too, especially because they like to drink fog and release precipitation, essentially making rain themselves. Newer research even has identified two different types of leaves on redwoods, one specifically for drinking water and another separate leaf for photosynthesis. You might see along the way that I've added some websites that are easy to access and remember, and these will get you to more information on the topics that I'm discussing. Let's talk a little bit about old growth redwoods. One essential feature of our work at Sempervirens Fund is to protect the old growth redwoods that remain and to establish the old growth of the future. The term old growth generally describes larger trees, usually at least 3.3 feet in diameter and over 200 feet tall, with certain features that only develop in older trees, such as a plate-like bark, larger branches, broken tops, platforms in the canopies, dead tops, basal hollows, the sort of carved out base of the tree, often carved out by fire, and reiterated crowns, meaning trunks that come off of other trunks. Features like these, that typically take a coast redwood 200 years or more to develop, support many species and contribute to the tree's resilience to fire, drought, and climate change. So you can imagine that in a time of clear cutting, when these trees were coming down, the species at large was losing those features that really protected both the trees and wildlife and other characteristics of the forest. From a conservation standpoint, though, age alone is not always the best indicator of old growth status. Although a redwood can live to be 2,000 years old, some may say 200 years qualifies as old growth, especially when you consider the trees that have survived that era of clear cutting. It's possible for a redwood to live 200 years old as well without developing old growth characteristics if it doesn't have optimal conditions to reach its full potential. For example, a redwood tree in a city park may live to be 200 years old without developing old growth characteristics like size, because it does not have space to spread its roots 100 feet from its base, or it lacks neighboring redwood roots that provide anchoring and nutrients. Or perhaps fog is absent and water cannot meet a redwood's highest reaches. Complex structure features are important in both individual trees and forest-wide. Diversity in tree ages creates a diversity of habitat conditions with multi-layered plant communities, which provide food sources for animals and promote that famous fog drip. Broken tops, fire scars, basal hollows, large reiterated limbs, reiterated crowns, they all provide habitat for different plants and animals. Even dead trees are integral in the forest, Large standing dead trees called snags are critical for wildlife like nesting owls and other birds. Now let's talk a little bit about fire. Redwoods are really, really good at being subject to fire. The disturbance of fire actually is a healthy thing for redwoods when it's done right. Here's some reasons why. We've already talked about the needles. In mature redwood trees, bark can grow at least a foot thick. It prevents fire from getting to the more easily burned sapwood behind the bark. This bark has high water content, which also helps prevent it from burning easily. Coast redwoods contain a significant amount of the chemical tannin in their bark and in their heartwood. Tannin does not burn easily. It's a natural flame retardant. It's the tannin that gives redwoods their reddish color and also protects them against bees, fungi, and insects. Height. Height's important. Redwoods are the tallest trees in the world, and most fires start on the ground. Being so tall prevents most wildfires from spreading up to the tops of the trees where their needles soak in sunlight and moisture to keep the tree alive. So redwoods thrive in fire. While many of us think about redwoods as fire resistant, which they are also fire adaptive, meaning that fire is a key factor in their germination, regeneration, and even survival. Fire enriches soil with nutrients for falling redwood seeds to thrive in, and it can also unlock seed banks in the base of redwoods. For millennia, the indigenous peoples who lived in and among redwoods would burn the forest understory to promote these exact features of nutrient richness and unlocking the seeds that help the redwoods thrive. It also helps to help them maintain and manage the understory for the plant species that were most important to them. Redwoods and fire have had a long and compatible history. But we are in a different age, and the wildfires are bigger and more furious than they've been in the past. You might know that in August of 2020, thousands of lightning strikes throughout redwood forests in the Santa Cruz Mountains ignited fuels in several places. And 48 hours later, 5,000 acres of spot fires erupted into 48,000 acres of inferno, engulfing Big Basin Redwood State Park in the north and much of another property called San Vicente Redwoods in the south, which I'll talk about later. The flames themselves were 1 to 200 feet higher than the tallest redwoods in Big Basin. The fire, in fact, was so hot that the water in the redwood trees would boil and explode, topping trees throughout the forest. Despite the ferocity of the fire and the toll on other tree species, the communities nearby, and on wildlife, more than 90% of redwoods are expected to survive the fire. But it will take time for them to look like redwoods once again. One of the most common questions we got following the fire was how long before burned redwoods look red again? It's about 40 years. Most of a redwood tree's energy is dedicated in that time following fire to restoring their reserves, healing over wounds, and propagation. Tannins, or what makes them red, are among the last resources to come back. So let's talk a little bit about climate change. What are we facing? While the CCU fire felt like a wake-up call for many, we had been concerned about climate change for some time, and that's because there were dire conditions already persisting. Rising temperatures being among the greatest concern. They have great impact. They stunt trees in most cases. In some cases, trees are trying to grow more quickly than they can support themselves. And in both cases, tree viability, complexity, storage capacity for both water and carbon, they all suffer. Precipitation is less predictable. Without year-round fog and rain, redwoods have less reliable resources and propagation suffers. Extreme storms are more likely to topple damaged or stressed trees, and flooding will destabilize roots and landscapes. Despite all the rain we've been getting lately, you might remember that we were just in an extreme drought throughout the state. Recent droughts have been so extreme that redwoods are depleting their stored resources just to survive. Die-offs in some regions became evident in recent years, where reliable underground water resources were drying up. And remember that crazy fire, the CZU fire, that all came on the heels of a summer with unseasonably low levels of fog. So not only were the forests subject to high temperatures and lightning strikes and fuel in the ground, but they didn't have the fog benefiting them from the treetops to the roots to help them replenish their water reserves. So all these impacts lead to what we call bad fire. While good fire helps redwoods thrive, bad fire is so extreme, like the CZU fire, that it puts extreme stress on forests to recover and for the species to thrive. One of the most concerning impacts of wildfire are not the immediate impacts, despite how devastating they can be, but really it's about the increased risk of repeat fire. Another CZU fire in the same area, in the same decade, would vastly increase mortality of redwood species. Okay, so we've talked about the threats. What does the research say? Climate models are very challenging because they often look at landscapes too big to account for the variability among microclimates. And as you may know, redwoods thrive for a lot of reasons, including the varying topography and many microclimatic differences in the regions where fog and year-round precipitation are historically plentiful. But important new research has looked more closely at the variability in the redwood region and found that the 37th parallel is proving to be the critical horizon for redwoods. Above it, or north of Santa Cruz, redwoods are more likely to grow at historic rates and create the complexities that benefit both it and other species. But at or below that parallel, redwoods are more likely to be stunted, smaller, and less complex. Our own data modeling for the Santa Cruz Mountains has been updated with rich new climate data from the Nature Conservancy, allowing us to look almost acre by acre to see where redwoods are under the most threat or most likely to find the best refuge. It is informing our conservation approach with some precision. So, we're taking action. Last year, we turned that data, this growing body of research, and our forestry expertise into a climate action plan for redwoods. I encourage you to have a look at the whole plan, but here are our 3 top priorities. Protecting the right land means expanding habitat for endangered, threatened, and sensitive wildlife and plant species and communities by protecting more miles of streams and acres of wetlands and watershed lands. It means bolstering the largest protected area in the Santa Cruz Mountains by expanding the parks at Ano Nuevo, Butano, and Big Basin, which together form tens of thousands of acres of already conserved and protected lands and redwood forests. And supporting the state's 30 by 30 goals by contributing 1/3 of the conservation needed in the Santa Cruz Mountains through the purchase and permanent protection of land. We're already 1/3 of our way on our goal of protecting 7,000 acres. Stewarding forests in the best way means helping the biggest trees accelerate growth through active management, increasing forest health, and expanding carbon storage. It also means improving conditions for dynamic regional biodiversity through healthier forests and aquifer recharge in protected watersheds. And it supports the restoration and recovery of forests so they might thrive as well as survive climate change. Helping protect us all means increasing protection of drinking water sources for nearby communities. sustaining those unique and vital microclimates of redwood forests, which buffer temperature rise and diminish the impact of storms on local communities, and supporting and promoting equitable access to nature for our well-being and for all to enjoy. So why are we hopeful? We have a pretty good proof of concept. South of Big Basin is San Vicente Redwoods. We own the land with another land trust, Peninsula Open Space Trust. Save the Redwoods League has a conservation easement over the entire property. Together with our partners, we also partner with an array of expert organizations from the UCs, including researchers at UCLA, to CAL FIRE, the Resource Conservation District, indigenous partners, and many more to restore and preserve forests, manage working forests, and restore grasslands and ponds. We've removed a dam, planted tens of thousands of trees, and established many, many miles of shaded fuel breaks. We've seen coho salmon return and hope to establish new habitat for red-legged frogs. We know what it takes to help wilderness thrive. As I mentioned earlier, nearly all of San Vicente burned in the CZU fire, but it's coming back. And we are actively managing the forests and natural resources to both recover and be better prepared for the next fire. The land itself is a living laboratory for conservation, forestry, and stewardship. I want to leave you with a look at what we think about when we think about wilderness and when we think about wilderness today. It has helped shape Sempervirens' own understanding of wilderness. 25 years ago, when I began working in conservation, and as it happened, canvassing door to door for the Sierra Club, the goal was often to find pristine wilderness areas, put a fence around them, and never touch them again. That has been the conventional wisdom for well over a century in the redwood forests of the Santa Cruz Mountains and across many of America's natural landscapes. Excuse me. For a public that is accustomed to that model and to the concept of wilderness, contemporary conservation practices like tree thinning and prescribed burning might look shocking. Seeing a redwood tree felled or fire creeping through forests can be horrifying when we've told ourselves for a century that these things are harmful to forests. But if we take one lesson from the explosion of wildfires in the western United States, such as the CZU fire in 2020, it should be that the conservation tactics of the last 100 years have missed the mark. In the face of extreme weather caused by climate change, our conservation practices must evolve to meet the moment. We still need to protect more wilderness areas, but we can no longer leave them untouched and expect them to thrive. Here you see a picture of a core sample being taken from a tree. With that core sample, we're seeing the signals of climate change over tens and hundreds of years. We're understanding, as core samples are taken across the region, how fire and drought and flooding has shaped the land by learning from the trees. We're using that research and we're using the expertise that we've developed to restore and keep redwoods growing towards those old growth characteristics to good advantage, and has put us in a really good position to think about the future of redwoods and what wilderness can mean for the future. So with that, I thank you for inviting me to join you. I hope this has given you a sense of how remarkable redwoods are and how even that the species, despite its endurance over eons, is at risk to succumb to the climate crisis. Sempervirens Fund, we do hold out hope for redwoods and are grateful to help their and our story as a community that cares for our magnificent natural communities. And if I may, I'll just share a quick video that we are about to make public. So you are among the first to see it, and it's a little bit of an ad for our organization and what we think redwoods accomplish.
Thank you, Matt. That was a beautiful video.
Thank you. And thank
Um,
you so much for having me.
I'm really glad that you came today to share with us because after that fire, of course, it was a big concern for, everyone. What will the impact be if the redwoods go? And I'd also like to just have you comment on redwoods in our climate zone because we're in the
Yes.
Los Angeles basin, and maybe you could talk a little bit about that as well.
Yeah, so there's been a lot of work to establish redwoods in many places around the country and world. There are redwood groves in Los Angeles, of course. There are efforts to bring redwoods north to the Pacific Northwest. I've even heard of some groves trying to be established in the Midwest. It's very fascinating to us to see these efforts to bring the species other places outside of their natural range. There's always the concerns that they'll displace other species, they won't be compatible, or with other ecosystems nearby. But I think there's a lot of hope in bringing redwoods to other places because when they do get established, they are very healthful trees for the local environment. Their root systems are really good at sharing resources. There's some studies about the communication skills of redwood trees, being able to signal to each other when they need things, and not just each other, but other trees in their region. There's research that shows that Douglas firs, which like to grow around redwood trees, have benefited from redwood trees over the last century or more as they've become cohabiting, they've cohabited landscapes. What I would say about the prospects of redwoods in the Los Angeles region, south of the range itself, is that they're subject to the same challenges as the redwoods in their naturally occurring forests. Rising temperatures, precipitation, challenges with precipitation and drought, all can contribute to stressed trees. But redwoods growing outside of the forest grow a little differently. They certainly establish themselves well, but they often don't grow as tall, aren't as hardy, and they don't take on many of the more complex characteristics. That's because they don't have the resources, including other redwood trees often, to rely on to grow as expansively as they do in their natural habitat. There is there are theories that the redwood species will benefit as a species with growth outside of its natural range because it is opportunities to learn about the stresses themselves by studying the trees growing outside of the range. So it's always beneficial to see redwoods growing in these other places and learning from them, their growing characteristics in those other places.
Thank you for explaining that. That's interesting to hear, and it makes sense, of course, for those of us who see redwoods in other locations. Now, I kind of understand why they would not necessarily thrive in a different climate. I'm going to open the floor to questions. Does anyone here have a question they would like to ask Matt?
Um,
Hey, Gail.
yeah. I noticed you didn't have the Chilean redwoods noted on your map. What about extending the redwoods in that area?
The Chilean redwoods?
Yes.
Um, I'll be honest, I'm less familiar with that species. I've only really come to know about the coast redwoods, the giant sequoias, and the dawn redwoods. I've heard recently about the Chilean species, so it's something that I'll have to look into, but it's not something that we spend a lot of time thinking about at Sempervirens Fund.
Yeah, they were Chile was trying to get rid of them at one time, but now some of them Chileans have banded together to protect them.
That's interesting. Yeah, I didn't know that story. I'll have to look into it. Thanks for sharing that.
Okay.
Who else has a question? Sylvia?
Hi.
Hi, Sylvia.
Um, so I had a question regarding growth of the redwood, mostly like in the backyard or as a sapling to be planted later on in, a more suitable place. So, and I was wondering why my redwood died.
Oh,
So last year, I purchased a couple of sequoias and a redwood. They were all saplings. And the redwood was doing great. It was about that tall and it was doing just great. And then all of a sudden, it just within a day or so, it went kind of limp and then it died.
oh
And I
dear.
couldn't figure out why. The two sequoias are still doing wonderful and they've grown since and all that. But I could not figure out why the redwood went from doing great and then just dying.
Yeah.
When we were at Muir Woods a few months ago, I actually asked that question and I was told that the redwoods are actually harder to grow than the sequoia.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Okay.
Giant sequoia are a much hardier species. They grow more in the mountainous ranges of California. They also have a different makeup in their biochemistry. They actually succumb to fire. They are not as hardy in fire. They don't need as much water and water resources as coast redwoods. Coast redwoods just love to be pampered with water. The more water, the better. The water from underground, the water from above, the fog. The more constant that they are getting water, the better they are. And one of the things that we saw during the drought is the more standing trees that were stressed were coming down, toppling, or dying because they just don't have despite the massive storage capacity that they have, they are also sharing those resources with other trees. They're literally moving water from one tree to another and helping each other out. And if you don't have a tree to help you, if you don't have that network around you, it's harder for a single tree to thrive in unusual conditions when it's a coast redwood.
So would you recommend having like 3, 4 saplings growing near each other so they can help each other even when they're saplings or what?
Well, we get this question a fair amount, and even in the Santa Cruz Mountains where redwoods abound, people like to plant redwoods in their on their properties as well. And we always recommend to talk to an arborist because what happens is your microclimate wherever you live could be very different than the next microclimate over. And the conditions, they differ from place to place. And that
Mm-hmm.
really matters. Redwoods are a little bit delicate in that way. Despite their stature, they're pretty delicate in how they respond to the climatic conditions right under their roots.
Mm-hmm. It, I have seen in most places that I've seen, and I'm talking about in the La Crescenta area and Griffith Park, and um, usually there are a few trees. I haven't seen just one.
Yeah. Yeah. It's common to try and plant them in groups because they
Mm-hmm.
do support each other. Yeah, and they grow well together. But if they grow too closely together, then it's having the opposite effect because then they're competing for the resources right under their roots. So that's the other challenge. When we're thinking about the health of a redwood forest, a lot of the second generation forests that began to sprout up after clear cutting, you had this mono sort of culture in terms of the age. And so they were all growing at the same time, and they were much denser than redwood forests are supposed to be. And so that was another limiting factor for redwood trees to thrive over the last century. sometimes a tree would dominate and take over a space, or two trees would combine and come together and create one large tree. And then you would begin to see some dominance happen through natural selection. Recreating those kinds of characteristics is a bit of science and a bit of art. And I think with a skilled arborist, you might be able to get a good plan together for redwood experience in your own property.
Okay. And would you recommend planting sequoia rather than redwood?
I don't know as much about giant sequoia other than I know that they're hardier species, and I've heard that they tend to grow more frequently in unusual places because of that.
Okay. Because I mean, in terms of size, yes, they are going to grow really big, but I mean, not in my lifetime. I mean, they're going to be toddlers in my lifetime
That's
and
right.
in the lifetime of any of our properties. So I don't think that that would be a major concern. Um, but in terms of how hardy it is, that's an issue. We had another redwood that was a few years back, and it was potted, and it did grow for about 5 years, but then it just, again, almost overnight, it just died, and we couldn't quite figure out why it died, because we thought it had adequate water, but I'm not sure I'm not sure really how to gauge the amount of water we give
Right.
and
Right.
what's appropriate. And since they're looking for fog, should they be misted?
Yeah, so I think you're hitting on something that's really key about redwoods is because they're so big, or intended, even if they're intended to be so big, they're building a vascular system that's supposed to bring water up
Mm-hmm.
tens and hundreds of feet, which takes a lot of energy. And so the
Mm-hmm.
beauty of fog is that it helps create those water resources at the top of the tree, where gravity does the work and it brings the water down.
Mm-hmm.
There's been some recordings, I don't have links to them, of listening to trees, listening to redwood trees, and you can hear the water moving throughout the
Mm-hmm.
tree, throughout its vascular systems. So yeah, that may, again, we always recommend going to the arborists for support, but I think misting probably would be a good additional strategy for uh, backyard redwood health.
Got it.
Yeah, thank you for
Mm-hmm.
bringing the species to your community.
Oh, yes.
And we hope they'll actually be able to survive in the Southern California area, which is, a hotter climate than they're used to.
Yeah.
Do we have questions from anyone else that Matt can answer?
I just have a comment. I've had one in my backyard for over 40 years and it's doing very well.
Hmm.
I
And
guess
where
I
do
will.
you live, Chuck?
San Fernando Valley. It's pretty hot out here. I guess I
And John LaJeunesse, I don't know how many redwoods over in La Crescenta in his backyard. I heard that he had to clear them or do something to them recently, because I forget exactly what was the issue, but he grew them to a little forest right in his front yard and side yard.
Chuck, what have you done anything special to help your trees?
no, I just nothing really. Just planted it about 40 years ago and it's just keeps growing. Got kind of about 3 or 4 years ago it started getting kind of brown. So I give it a few soakings every few days and it's kind of recovered. But so far so good.
One of the things we find in the Santa Cruz Mountains is that the northern facing slopes are really important because they're going to remain wetter. And so as we're thinking about climate refugia for redwoods that are under stress. We're thinking about conservation and planting practices on the northern slopes, wherever possible, particularly around watershed areas. Sylvia and Chuck, underground water resources are also a factor. Sometimes if you are away from an aquifer, that can be a challenge. If you're near an aquifer, that can be a bonus.
Mm-hmm. Is there any education done regarding growth of redwoods to like schools, for example? I brought this up because I just recalled my daughter's school had, were they 8 redwoods, something like that. And I mean, they're outside in 2 nice little rows. They're outside classrooms. And 4 or 5 years back, the property manager for the school said, "Oh, I'm going to have them cut because of, I forget exactly what." And uh, we were lucky that we had a good relationship with that particular property manager, and we were also taking care of the gardening in the school. And immediately we're like, no way. I mean, it took hundreds of years to get it to that point. No, you're not cutting them. So as far as we know, they're still standing. But is there any protection for them? Like oaks, they have protection. Is there any protection for the redwoods?
Not typically in that way. And again, for organizations like ours, we focus on established forests, as opposed to private lands where newer redwoods may have been planted for local groves. But we have gotten requests to help save trees, and we usually recommend going to your local legislator. In Santa Cruz County, we always talk about the Board of Supervisors here. They're really more attuned to helping protect individual trees or a small grove of trees.
Okay.
Great question. Let me see if there's any other people who'd like to ask questions, because we want to be considerate of Matt's time this evening. Do we have any other people who have questions from our audience?
I have a question.
Great ahead.
Are there any universities that are currently conducting research at the living laboratories?
So very many. We have relations. Thanks for asking. We have relationships with UCLA, San Jose State, UC Santa Cruz, Cal Poly Humboldt. It goes on and on and on. There's lots of different. There's so much research going on. In fact, the vast majority of redwoods research has been conducted in the last 20 years. It's just proliferate at the moment. There's been a really remarkable, you may recall the study I mentioned that talked about the 37th parallel being sort of this horizon point for redwoods in a time of climate crisis. That was done by a group of very seasoned researchers from Cal Poly Humboldt, some of the most prolific experts in redwoods, dendroecology, sort of reading the data of redwood rings and looking at those climate signals. There's just so much research going on. It's unbelievable. And even the fact that we just learned in the last year that there are 2 different kinds of leaves on redwood trees just shows you how little we know and how much there is to learn about these magnificent species.
That's awesome to hear.
Yeah.
I'm personally interested in conducting research, but I do live in Southern California right now, so I'm looking at options for school and just wondering where else. So
yeah, we're working with I'll have to look for the name of the actual school at UCLA, but the research we're doing with them is actually not on redwoods, I should say, but on coho salmon. And they're doing eDNA research. So they're taking eDNA samples in a creek amongst redwood trees where we removed a dam. And removing that dam has replenished the stream with the cobble that really helps coho salmon find um, uh, 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 spawning habitat. And
Okay.
for the first time last year, we saw coho salmon.
Oh, wow. That's amazing to hear.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, good luck. I hope you find a place to go for great research. Thank you.
Matt,
Thank you.
Yes.
Bob Thompson, Crescenta Valley Sierra Club.
Hi, Bob.
Sylvia already mentioned, that some of our members like John LaJeunesse and also Jerry Burnham have planted coastal redwoods in their yards over 30 years ago. And now we think the FAA is going to come after them because the trees have gotten too high. And there's also a nice grove in Descanso Gardens too. Of
Oh,
redwoods.
terrific.
There's probably 30 of them in there that are doing well because they have the buddy system going, as you call it.
Yeah, yeah. That's
So,
great.
You talked about coastal redwoods. Are there other types of redwoods other than coastal redwoods that would grow in this area?
Well,
Yes.
we talked a moment ago about giant sequoia. It's a different species of redwood, and they're largely found in the mountainous areas of California. Um, uh, they're hardier species, and they're different. They function differently, but they're massive. They're big. They're not as tall, but they're larger in size and volume. So they might, do better in some cases in a more harsh climate. There's another species that I'm aware of largely in Japan, found in Japan, called dawn redwoods, and they're, as you might guess, a more delicate, slender species. And Gail mentioned a Chilean species of redwood, which I've heard of, but I guess I didn't realize was different. So I'll have to look into that.
Are there any programs in the planning stages to get redwoods planted more in Southern California?
Well, the focus has largely been from a conservation perspective and from an ecological perspective on northern climates and moving them and establishing them above southern Oregon. There's an effort that's been well publicized recently in the New York Times and other places about efforts to try and migrate coast redwoods to the Pacific Northwest in and around Seattle. But I have not heard of any efforts to move them south because at the southern end of their natural range, they're under threat. They're having the greatest stress there. So moving them south, it would be counterintuitive, not necessarily counterproductive, but counterintuitive from what the research suggests.
Does that answer your question, Bob?
Thank you. Yes, I'm also a fire lookout in the Angeles Forest, and we have lots of good groves of coastal redwoods up there that are doing well.
That's terrific. Yeah.
It depends on if we have the right kind of moisture, right kind of canyon to grow in, and lots of good buddies to go with, huh?
Yeah, I think that's right.
If you're any program going with the Forest Service, to plant redwoods in different forests.
Yeah, there have been some efforts. There's largely through the state parks, but there have been some efforts through national parks. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Bob.
We're going to be considerate of your time, and
sure.
we're going to wrap up the presentation. It is 8 o'clock now, and I just want to see if anyone who hasn't spoken has a question. And we'll just give you a couple of seconds to pipe in. And if not, we're going to thank Matt for his presentation.
Hi, Pat.
Yes, Jeffrey.
Hi, I just wanted to thank you for organizing this evening and having Matt talk about one of my favorite subjects. To make it real quick, I don't really have a lot of questions. I guess Sempervirens is more on the acquisition of land preserving the trees as opposed to fire recovery and park creation. Is that so? Or
actually, we do all those things. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Thanks for asking.
I was aware of the alder fire kind of doing a job in Sequoia National Forest, and that was rather sad to hear that and hear that so many mature redwoods were decimated. And then I also saw where your acquisition in the Russian River area sounded rather exciting. For
that's our very good that's courtesy of our very good friends at Save the Redwoods League.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we work only in the Santa Cruz Mountains. We get to partner with them a lot.
Oh, I see. Okay.
They work more places around the state, and they work across both the Coast Redwood and Giant Sequoia regions. Yeah, great organization.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you. I wasn't aware that you were exclusively for Santa Cruz area,
Yeah,
but your interests are worldwide. Oh, very good. But thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Before you go, Matt, would you like to talk about how the fund is financed?
Absolutely. Yeah. So we are a donor-supported organization, philanthropy. And so most of our contributions come from individual donors. We have a growing and healthy relationship with many foundations. They've been very helpful in some major acquisitions in recent years. And even other land trusts support us. We have we have such a terrific relationship with our partner land trusts. We've sometimes we're seen as competitors, but we think of ourselves as competitors or peers, certainly. And so there's a lot of partnership in the Santa Cruz Mountains to protect things, bring our resources together, our skills together as other organizations. We have also, as we've become more prolific in our stewardship practices, gotten a fair amount of funding through state agency resources to help us with the active management of forests.
That's good to know. I'm glad that you are getting financing. And if anyone wants any more information, we do see your website. But do you want to give us any more information about it?
Yeah, sempervirens.org. There's so much to explore on the website about redwoods. If you type in the search bar anything you're interested in, you will find a story or three about it, I'm sure. We love to tell stories. We've got a YouTube channel. If you look up Sempervirens Fund on YouTube, we've got a YouTube channel, and we are also producing a series of curiosity stories with artists and thinkers who are out exploring and learning about redwoods, and we're following their journeys.
And just to recap, at the very beginning of our conversation, you defined for me what Sempervirens means. Do you want to just let everyone else know?
Sure, it's Latin for always green. And that's something we think about a lot at Sempervirens Fund.
We're so glad you could join us tonight
Thank you
and
for having me.
educate us more about the redwoods. And thank you so much for all of the information you've shared. It gives us something to think about as we're approaching the difficulties of climate change. And if there's anything more we can do, please let us know.
Well, thank you. And I really appreciate everybody's interest. And thanks for having me.
Absolutely.
And special thanks to you, Pat, for coordinating all this. It's been a pleasure working with you.
I'm happy I was able to do that.